Good afternoon, and welcome back to the continuation of the JSOU Future of SOF Forum on exploring the SOF identity. Once again, I'm Dr. Joseph Long, and hope everyone is ready to move into the second lens of the SOF identity, which is to understand SOF ethics. I will now step down from my role as forum host and into the role of moderator for the first panel centered on the question, what makes SOF ethics distinct and peculiar to ethics in other aspects of the DoD and the US government? I would like to introduce our three panelists. First, we have JSOU's very own Master Chief Brad Rhinelander, an experienced Special Operations Senior Enlisted Leader with a PhD in Public Policy. With him, we have Dr. Anthony Pfaff from the Army War College, who has a vast interest in publishing record in military ethics. And we also have Dr. Jeff McIllwain from San Diego State University, who studies the nexus between organized crime and welfare. Welcome all. I'd like to start out with Master Chief Rhinelander and provide each of you a few minutes to lay out your initial provocations, and then after that, we'll go back to Brad and allow the conversation to flow naturally from this point. So Brad, lead us off. What does your SOF experience tell you about ethics?
Thanks, Joe. I'd like to start this off harkening back to an experience I had as we were going about the comprehensive review, US SOCOM comprehensive review, and the incredible opportunity I had with Major General Donovan to speak to, quite a few US SOCOM commanders in the process of that. And one of them, the very first thing that one of them said was, tell them that you're proud of them. All too often, all the news stories we hear, there's a negativity bias of the things that SOF is doing wrong. And that's understandable, and we should be held account. But at the end of the day, the vast majority of the formation are doing incredibly things around the world on behalf of the nation. So I'd like to start off prefacing with that. This is going to be counter to probably some of the points of view of the other speakers and or the general audience, but I don't think that there is anything necessarily different about SOF ethics. I think that there's a difference of degree with respect to the speed and consequence in the environments we find ourselves. If you will, the strength of the thread that we need to go into the labyrinth multiple times, not just once, but multiple times to kill minotaurs without becoming the minotaur ourselves. However, I caution everybody when we start talking about things as too SOF specific, because we end up creating barriers to our own communication. And our ability to navigate that labyrinth is incredibly contingent on our multiple identities that we carry. Even in the darkest hours of the night, when I'm the person that people are afraid of in the night, I'm still a father, I'm still connected to my family, I'm still a friend and a citizen of this nation. So I think there's a danger when we go too far down in our specialness and think that it's anything else. Or something specifically unique. This SOF ethics is necessarily, as is the DoD ethics, the ethics of our nation and the ethics of our population for whom we serve on their behalf. I think there is an issue across the enterprise as the DoD becomes increasingly corporate, that we lose contact with the coalface. Those that are serving in the contact layer out there doing operations and conducting operations, things become too politicized. The bureaucracy is large. This has been spoken to in previous panels this morning, and there's a danger there that we become detached and we don't recognize the failings that we have committed on behalf of the folks that are out there operating. One of the major things we saw in the comprehensive review is everybody is quick to point out things in the news stories, talk about people, submitting incorrect travel claims or things of that nature, which are obviously wrong. But in the meantime, there's much more egregious actions being taken, such as deploying forces in excess of what's required or anybody asked you to deploy that have very real consequences. So, I think as a leader and from an enterprise and organizational perspective, it's very easy to focus on the individual and get overly focused on correcting individuals without acknowledging the larger organizational issues that are at play here. And this has consequences in the modern strategic environment as well, as we once again look to technology as a panacea solution for a lot of things. One of the critical things that SOF provides is its humans. Humans that are certainly enabled by technology, but the human, it's a very human-centered approach. So we've seen this before historically, where following World War II, and we thought the nuclear age was going to change warfare forever, and we lost the emphasis on SOF, and then lo and behold, we rediscovered that we needed that capability in the force. Same thing following Vietnam, and we've seen this ebb and flood of appreciating what those humans bring to the table, and I see it once again. So I think we can talk at length about the how we build that strong thread that enables us to navigate the labyrinth in operational environments. But we also need to be aware that as the DoD and SOCOM has become more corporate and the bureaucracy has grown, how much energy and how much time we are expending navigating the labyrinth of just the internal organizational terrain, and how that distracts from building the force and capability that we need ethically. And I'll go ahead and pause there for the other speakers, Joe.
Thank you very much, Brad. I appreciate that, and that's a great way for us to get started. So now I will go ahead and pass the baton on to Tony Pfaff. Take a few minutes and lay out some of your initial thoughts, please, sir.
No, happy to. And thanks for inviting me. Very happy to be here. And I don't disagree with Brad. I think it is probably a mistake to think of special operations ethics as something different, because I don't think ethics really change much. However, different situations and different contexts change. And when that happens, what decisions count as ethical and what kind of factors count as relevant to those decisions can change. And SF's challenge is, I think, better framed sort of as Brad did, which is how do we navigate those multiple environments? How do we, and keep track of all the different kinds of ethical considerations we have to keep in mind. And to kind of make a long story short, I mean, we can think about it this way. If conventional warfare, for example, is about imposing one's will on an enemy, then it's best won through attrition. And that permits killing combatants and destroying things that are inseparable from warfighting. And when it's impossible to do that, well, and it also prohibits killing non-combatants and those and certain kinds of civilian and destroying certain kinds of civilian infrastructure. And when that's not possible to do the necessary killing and destroying, it permits operations that risk harm to non-combatants, but they still have to be discriminate and proportional. It's also worth noting that even when dealing with combatants, ethics prohibits perfidy, which is essentially, taking unfair, deceiving unfairly. So, for example, using false surrender flags is not permitted because it's self-defeating. We shouldn't want to kill, and making surrender more difficult means we may have to do more killing that is necessary to win. So it's off limits, even if there is a short-term advantage. But that's not the environments that SF typically operates in, particularly these days. And if we're going to talk about, I like Brad's use of the word contact layer, but we're kind of talking about that level of competition or that level of conflict below the threshold of war, which is a lot more about getting the adversary to conform to our interests. It's about shaping their behavior, not achieving physical objectives like regime change or territorial control. In this sense, it's kind of a little bit more like law enforcement, in that there's some kind of order that, even if it's very thin, that allows for the interests that we have in the first place. So, for example, much of our competition with Russia and China is about getting them to abide by certain norms regarding boundary claims and interfering in others' internal politics than it is about a particular interest. And more to the point, it's about getting them to abide by those norms without escalating to war to settle it. And this requires coercion, while at the same time de-emphasizes escalation, or actually emphasizes de-escalation. And I think in this environment, it seems makes us want to open up other things that would normally not be permitted in conventional contexts. For example, what about information operations, where one might want to employ deception, or intelligence gathering and other kind of missions that special operations forces might engage in that might involve lying, lying, cheating, and stealing. And here the difficulty, so this is one way to think of the challenge. The difficulty here is not so much what those norms that we want our adversaries to conform to should be, but that what are the norms that apply to our operations to get them to that point. They're much less clear. Paraphrasing Peter Singer, who noted, competition is not won by missiles and bombs, but by those able to shape the storylines that frame our understanding, provoke responses that impel action, and connect at personal levels and on a global scale. And as Brad said, again and again, this is a role that special operations forces play constantly. And to put it simply, it's more about shaping adversary choices and then incentivizing to choose the one that conforms most to our interests than imposing costs or the other things we might use force for. Now, and in so doing, so the question then is, if I can do any of these things would normally be permitted, but they prevent escalation, they lessen the kind of physical harms that happen, should they be permitted? And I'm going to set that aside and save that for questions because I'm about running out of time. But I also wanted to pick up another aspect that is important in covering these kinds of issues, and that's the moral psychological. Because there's one set of questions about what are the right courses of action, what counts as ethical. Then there's the other question about, given in the context when we know what that is, like Brad was saying, filling out false vouchers and that kind of thing, what's going on that is encouraging or incentivizing or leading to, resulting in this kind of behavior. And there's a lot to be said there. One way to think about it, one thing to think about is special operations, given their nature, require a lot of physical courage. However, the kind of unit cohesion that gives rise to the kind of extraordinary physical courage that special operation forces are demanded to exhibit on a regular basis can also, in that cohesion, set conditions to undermine moral courage, because you don't want to rat out your buddy. Particularly if there's other reasons or distrust at higher levels. And addressing that, I think, is something that should be a part of this discussion, as well as the larger discussion that the special operations community might want to have. On that cheerful note, I will conclude.
Thank you very much, Tony. I really appreciate that. And so we'll come in with our third initial presentation. So Jeff, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I've had the fortune of being able to teach in the irregular warfare and other programs at Joint Special Operations University for a number of years now. And the area that I'm asked to talk in is the area of my professional interest and research, which is the intersection of organized crime with warfighting and intelligence issues. These, of course, are lead to some very interesting discussions over the years. And as I've worked in different places around the world doing field research and good old-fashioned archival research and everything else, you see a really interesting thing in terms of the behavior that exists in that sphere. And it's important as we talk about this issue of this distinct and peculiar aspect as it relates to SOF and ethics, that we think about it in terms of how we've been, discussing conflict, areas like hybrid warfare, unrestricted warfare, convergence, all these different concepts. But when you look at them, for example, like in unrestricted warfare, and you break it down and you see what the Chinese were talking about in that document, you're talking about things like smuggling warfare, fabrication warfare, resource warfare, drug warfare, all these things. You see where organized crime has a particular aspect right there, but you also see how other areas and other authorities are impacted by this. So as SOF is asked to engage in this area, they're being asked to do so in the spirit of this whole of government idea, this whole of government, that we're working basically across the various lanes that we have that are established by our different authorities. You know, if it's a Title 10, if it's a Title 50, a Title 18, wherever Title 6, Homeland Security, there's all these particular authorities. And within those authorities, of course, are many, many gaps. And it's in those gaps that we tend to find oftentimes that our challenges exist. They knowingly exist in those areas because it's to their advantage to do so. And when we're looking at the various tools that we want to use to deal with that, we may turn to our allies, and then we may also turn to contractors or others to deal with them. At the end of the day, we're still left with areas where it's not clearly defined. And of course, SOF is oftentimes asked to enter those roles. And these are roles we may have some training in, we may have some background in, but they're oftentimes sometimes roles that we have to kind of learn as we go along and adapt, which is why we have our professionals that are trained to do these things. But in so doing, it gets to be a little interesting because there are aspects, for example, let's say in a policing function, you know, if you're dealing with the narcotics issues and the corruptions that are attendant to that, or the human trafficking elements, there's different, and if you're doing CI human in a space like that, you know, when you're working with police have a certain way of doing things and looking at things. They also have a very, very strong literature that deals with how their oath that they take when they go to do their job can be impacted by this type of environment that's unique to that policing function. So here we have an intersection, let's say SOF with a policing function, or SOF with some other governmental function that's going on, where people basically have different ways of doing things. Now, in policing, there's a major literature that's been established that deals with the idea of corruption and how does that work. It has to do with ethics and how one faces that sort of scenario. The reality is most places around the world, government is an entrepreneurial profession. One gets into government not for the salary that you're going to get. In Mexico, I was working for years. You'd have people with, you know, tons of uncashed paychecks. You know, it's referred to as taco money, basically. You use this to pay the vendors, but your money's earned through la plaza, the right to do business, the kickbacks that come in. It's been the same in our country for decades and decades and decades, over the last or so years, where there has been efforts to root that out, but it's still not rooted out. Officers in these positions who have been studied, people that have created these subcultures of specialized units, anti-gang, anti-narcotic, you know, whatever you want to pick, undercover agents who have to go undercover. There's a major literature on this showing how that specialization and being amongst the elite within that broader function creates certain ethical challenges, certain cost to individuals in their career in terms of moral drift and things along those lines that people talk about, where people begin to start thinking, well, is it about the patch or is it about something different? And, you know, are we doing this for the flag or for the community, or are we doing this for something different? Behaviors get tolerated, insularity can happen, all these different things. So when we look at organizations outside of policing too, we can see similar things and similar behaviors. So it's not a stretch to then say that when we look at the whole of the organization of, let's say, DoD, then we go into the SOF world, and then we go within the various components within that there will be these similar dynamics organizationally in terms of subculture, in terms of these things. And these aren't bad, these aren't good, these just are. And what it does is these things helped us to shape, in a sense, the way ethical decisions are made and how they're also dealt with. Is it the senior NCO that handles a situation as one is viewed to be maybe stepping out of line of what the ethics should be individually or organizationally or in terms of the nation and the national interest? Or is it something that gets done on another level? The problem is that when we deal with this issue and we're dealing with SOF, is that it's never purely about the national interest. It's not, and if there was some simple way of doing that, that would be wonderful, but we can't oftentimes agree what national interest is. And then we have the issue of how national interest can get used for other gains and for other things that thrust us in this realm of where organized crime, dark money, all these various aspects come into play, where once again, SOF is integrated. So this basically becomes the confirmation of the old Smedley Butler, idea of war being a racket. And when downrange, there's lots of things that provide certain temptations and other things that people can go one way or the other. And that's not unique to SOF. It's not, but SOF is often in the position because it's dealing with, once again, filling the gaps in these areas where others are supposed to fill. And oftentimes people just really aren't expecting this, or if they do expect it, how do you handle it? So as these things happen, and if it's we're in this policy and we see X and we're kind of questioning whether or not who's the benefit, is it for allied, and is it for some donor back home, or who names it, you can see where people can begin to start asking questions about national interest, and the morality of that can begin to influence the decision making that's downrange. Remember the old adage in catch-20 enemy is whoever's trying to do. And if it's if there's unethical aspects in the policy, we have to realize that there's a center of gravity there, just as there is organizationally, just as there is individually. And as I said, other organizations have put a lot of time and attention in this, because what their understanding is, not only does this impact, once again, the image of the organization, but also the patch and what it stands for, and also what it does to the individual in particular, who really wasn't thinking about this when they were 18 and they signed on, but they find themselves 15, 20 years now engaged in things and activities which provide ethical challenges they may or may not be prepared for, because they never prepared to go out of that traditional authority and to go in these different areas. The nature of the things that we face are just going to continue to bring this to the fore. There's nothing new in this. If you go back, you can go read Thucydides and read about, Listae, the brigands that were in the areas between the city states and how they had to interact with them. You can read about the, 100 Years' War and see how organized crime was intimately involved with working with the interest of the various folks fighting there. You can't escape this. And so in many ways, we just kind of have to remove, in a sense, the idea that this innocence that some folks would have, that it's always going to be about the patch, that there's going to be clear lines and there's going to be clear lanes, and there's going to be clear authorities, and those challenges are just going to have to be dealt with as a part of life. And that's when you hopefully build up a professional in this field, and you have the leadership, and the leadership is supposed to be in a position to really be able to keep people on track on this. And at what levels are we doing this? How do we look at best practices that have been done, the case studies that have been done? How does this get rolled into training and into the PME process? These are some things that can probably be of great service as people are trying to find out, how do we actually do this thing as we're facing these ethical dilemmas. And that'll be all.
Thank you very much, Jeff. I appreciate it. And you brought up a lot of fascinating things for us to dive into as we go along. So we'll definitely come back to you. I wanted to go back to Brad, and I'm reflecting on a conversation you had with me recently about looking at SOF ethics as a function of degree over kind. And I wanted to see if you could address that along the context of degree versus kind and binary ethics.
Yeah, Joe. I mean, I think both Tony and Jeff, I think brought up some great points, right? And there's a story to tell about SOF, right? And too often we're just hearing the negative stories. And as previous speakers talked about, I think it's also important to be specific. The US SOCOM as an enterprise and SOF as an enterprise are quite large. US SOCOM is an HQ. There's very diverse capability within SOF, so there's specificity required there. But I think there's an increasing rift between kind of that corporate architecture, in many cases where technology and the acquisition of very, very high dollar platforms is overshadowing the human aspects, and we get relegated to almost representing the caricatures that we see in see in media when we talk about SOF and ethics. And, as Jeff mentioned, there's an important social psychological function that occurs at the team level, at the platoon level, ODA level. And what we don't want to do is drive that underground. And then that's all contingent on trust throughout the organization, trust that leaders are going to, adequately understand the challenges that the forces are facing as they move through these environments and on the edge of the map where there are certainly monsters, as Jeff alluded to, and coming in contact with those monsters. And so, the growing rift, I think, between kind of the more corporate senior leadership aspects of the DoD and SOCOM aren't helpful, because what you're going to do is you're going to eliminate your ability to maintain awareness and knowledge of whether what's forming at that level is healthy or not. And there's certainly unhealthy cultures, as we've seen in news stories. There's certainly unhealthy cultures that can form, whether it's with a police precinct or a SEAL platoon or an SF ODA. So when we're not honest and aware of the kind of social and psychological realities of the organization, you're not doing yourself any favors, and you're just going to continue to widen that rift and eliminate your own sensors of being able to see what's occurring and modify it if need be, or influence it and continue to shape. So that you're bringing out the best of the very talented force that we have. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely, Brad. Thank you very much. Jeff, I wanted to circle back to you and see if you could ignite us in this discussion on the ways that criminal organizations might manifest themselves in an environment where we're conducting population-centric, insurgency or counterinsurgency type operations, and what kind of ethical dilemmas those organizations would potentially pose for our operators.
Sorry, part of this stems from the fact that when we view something like organized crime, we tend to view it as a virus, that it's something that, we basically can put together a targeting package on and say, go all Donnie Brasco undercover, or use our other abilities to identify who leadership, you decapitate the leadership, roll it up, and then, of course, everything's going to be perfect when you're done with that, right? Which, of course, never happens. It creates vacuums with all these horrible things that go along with it. And the reason that is because organized crime, in particular, is embedded as a social system in a particular area. It means that there's upper world and underworld people. As legitimate power networks rely on the illegitimate power networks to stay in power. The reality is, you can't hire everybody to be a police officer, and police can't be everywhere. If you're going and looking at these, the mega city idea that Davis talks about, and you go to Mumbai and you go to these other places, when going into these areas, like I was in one like this in India, it's not police that are policing the areas, and the police tacitly allow for informal networks to work these things. But there's also other aspects of governance outside of policing that have to go on. And those governance are good. That governance is going to be deferred to the informal networks. Then there's going to be the corporate side of it, where people are trying to, get involved with the business, the moving of food and other types of things. All these things get ingrained with each other as the unions get involved in other things. So here we go. We're going to go work in this large urban, the guerrillas are coming out of the mountain. They're in the major cities, and we're some shanty town somewhere, and where all this stuff is happening. We just oftentimes just don't have the idea. This reminds us, when we went into Fallujah, where, we go to the mayor, we go to the people that run things, but it's really being run by a whole shadow network that's been involved with smuggling and other issues going back for centuries. And all of a sudden, there's this whole other aspect. And if we start picking strings on that, then we start getting into the tribal, we start getting into the family and other dynamics that all of a sudden bring other things in. So this embeddedness of these social systems, it's a very serious thing. And we have to think of it holistically and then say, if we're squeezing here in this particular city, how is this influencing this in our coalition partner in the city 50 miles away, or back in the capital, or in some other nation where there might be connectivity historically between point A and point B between two different cities because of the way the populations have migrated between there and the social networks and other things that are there. So oftentimes you think second, third order effects, you know, all you're doing is you're trying to deal with like a sex trafficking thing because that's being used to move weapons from A to B, that's helping insurgency A or whatever else. But then the next thing you know, it's backing up all the way up in the Netherlands and it's going to the Ukraine, and and you're like, wait, what happened here? And that's a difficult thing when people are put in a situation like that, because really, what's the ethics of this? Is it better sometimes to leave things alone and let them be, just track on it for information purposes? Is it better to get involved? And if so, does that create more violence, more harms? And these are things that, if you're on the tip of the lance aspect, those aren't questions you're really, wrestling with. You're downrange, but all of a sudden you're dealing with the effects of that and the blowback that can possibly happen. And so the questions and the ethics and the decision-making that goes further up the pike, and being able to support individuals that if they go in there and the hornet's nest is unknowingly put out, you don't leave people like Brad hanging because all of a sudden they were tasked to do something that we find out, oh, it's national interest. Yeah, but it also happened to be very helpful to this particular company with the board of, politician X, Y, and B's wife on it or something on those lines. So, it can get murky pretty quick, and politically, all of a sudden the ethics on the individual can that of the decision making that led to that situation downrange. So I don't know. I'm sorry, that's a lot of stuff there, but believe me, there's really good examples in my brain I would like to use. I just don't have the time here.
No, I appreciate it, and I enjoyed the idea that you used the word murkiness, and that's kind of what we're getting at, is trying to explore some of the things that happen with that. And then the previous panel, Colonel Sanez and Duclos were talking about, the idea of special operations working with and through partner forces. And this makes me think that now we're talking about working with and through other types of independent actors with varying levels of legitimacy, which creates some of that murkiness. So I wanted to ask you, Tony, what are your thoughts on that, given that we were talking about, in your opening comments, a little bit about inflicting your will upon other actors?
Yeah, no, thanks for that. And this actually, I think, ties into some of the points Jeff was making earlier, both in his initial comments and in the conversation we were just having on criminal organizations. First of all, none of this, ethics does not mean that you don't work with unsavory actors, right? But it means there's going to be an ethics for acting with unsavory actors. And we can think about this perhaps in terms of proxies, right? Because ultimately that's kind of what we're asking is there is an organization or individual that we want to act on our behalf. And they are, and there's something unsavory about them that would make that relationship problematic. And that is, that's certainly a concern. It's certainly a concern for special operations forces because often they're making these decisions on the ground. It's one thing when at the national level we decide to, use a state or have a proxy relationship with another state. It's another thing when you're doing this on the ground. So how do you think about that? There's going to be a number of things. I've written a lot about proxy ethics, and there's a number of things to consider. First, how do the interests align? And in that alignment, what is the likelihood of the proxy abandoning us, or even worse, us abandoning the proxy and leaving that them hanging? And then you have to think of the moral hazards. And so in that alignment, there has to be, this kind of goes back, and Jeff, if you want to say more about what you mean national interest doesn't matter or never matters, ultimately there has to be that relationship, and that alignment has to tie into some good, essentially, and we hope that that good comes from the mission that that the special operations are on, and the interest that that mission hopefully serves. And if those things aren't in place, chances are there's going to be something unethical, in that, and somewhere in those relationships. But when it comes to, but if you've got that settled, then you have moral hazards you have to worry about, and a big one, of course, is the problem of dirty hands. What happens when proxy does something that, is not something that you would normally permit. And that's a big problem for us. And this also goes to the point I made earlier regarding the fact there's just not a lot of norms about this out there. When it comes to international law, there are two precedents. And one that matters particularly for us is that the International Criminal Court found that the United States was not liable or responsible for the behavior of the Contras, even when they were killing civilians. Even though they found, whether you agree with this or not, even though they found that the United States had provided manuals suggesting these techniques, they determined the United States was not responsible for this behavior or these actions because there was no evidence of a direct order from any American official to do those kinds of things. So yet we still had a problem with dirty hands. What do you do about that? I think there's some things. I think ultimately that you have to make some kind of commitment to minimize the potential for that, impose a cost on the proxy when they do those kinds of things. And then I'll also go back to something like, Brad, you didn't use the word, but you did talk, I think you were talking about transparency. Ultimately, it might be as simple as, okay, if I do get called out in the Washington Post test, if I do get called out on this, did I have all my ducks in a row? Did my mission align with national policy? And is that, did that, and in committing that mission, am I taking additional actions to ensure that those potentials for harm, of which dirty hands is only one, are minimized? And when they happen, what am I doing about it? That's the next question you have to ask. You can't just walk away. What actions are you taking to address, perhaps hold people accountable for a bad act, depending on what it is, ensuring that it doesn't, doing your best to ensure it doesn't happen again. And at some point, if it really gets uncontrollable, you do have to rethink that relationship. But like Brad says, it's not binary. It's a process. You might get to a point at the end of the process that you do sever the relationship, but there's steps you can take and should take before you do so, as long as these other things align. How's that for an answer?
No, that's fantastic. And that takes me kind of to the next level that I was thinking about, because we're having this conversation about dirty hands and trust. So in my mind, I'm imagining a scenario where somebody in this environment might have to do something to demonstrate their willingness to have the dirty hands with this independent actor in a certain context, right? So at what point does my ability to build trust with this independent actor possibly conflict with my ability to build trust with my own chain of command or some of the folks that are at different levels that I report to? And so I wanted to go back to Brad and see if you had any thoughts on that, on balancing my need to build trust with the people I work with and also maintain that trust in this interesting and complex environment externally.
Yeah, no, I think, again, it goes back to transparency. I'm a big advocate of classifying things at the lowest possible level. And I think Director Petraeus spoke about this a little bit this morning. I can't count the number of times that I've been incredibly frustrated with how certain things are portrayed that you have firsthand knowledge of, right? And in many cases where there's evidence to counter a particular narrative, that's just a matter of somebody removing some data from whether it's an ISR feed or something of that nature, that the organization and the institution is not very responsive to do that, and we hurt ourselves by that. So I think you and I have spoken before about examples of claims being made about a strike against civilians when the operators on the ground know that A, there was ISR overhead, B, that there's footage of people actively engaging them, and those being the people that were struck. And meanwhile, you have senior leadership, thinking they're placating, calls for accountability by just saying, "Hey, we're reviewing this incident," when the best thing to do at that point in time would be to just make that footage public that shows, beyond any reasonable doubt that the individuals involved were armed combatants. I think that's a very simple example But that manifests itself constantly across the organization, not only with foreign partners and supported populations trust in U.S. activities in a certain area, but also with the domestic population's trust in the DoD and special operations and what they're doing. It's things like that. Again, I am a huge advocate that you better have a very, very compelling reason. And it's been my experience that the things that actually deserve to be classified are typically boring details that are underwhelming. But we have this default classification setting culturally, I guess, that I think is probably one of the most harmful things for us telling the right stories, and the people we rely on, the taxpayers, the citizens of this country, understanding what it is that's occurring in the world and what we're engaged in. And again, that just goes to impact internally within the enterprise. It goes to impact the trust, and that's a critical strand of that thread. We need to navigate the labyrinth, right? Like the trust that the operators have in senior leadership. It's just one more step to eroding it.
Thanks, Brad. I appreciate that. So now I'm thinking about a couple things here. I'm thinking about like going back to my days at the Naval Postgraduate School and the idea that guerrillas oftentimes use the war of the story in order to influence populations about what's going on. And we're seeing those things happen in some of the narratives that you were just talking about. Tony, I wanted to see if you could talk about maybe some of the frictions that come out of that, given that a good ethical dilemma presents frictions where you have a choice between two equally good or equally bad things. So what kind of dilemmas might emerge out of the frictions that we're talking about here?
Well, if you're talking about sort of the global narratives, that might be a little harder to, I might not have as much to say about that. But the way I've understood, we've used the word narrative here, it's more in that, I would call it operational, in the sense that we're making sense for our actions. And so we've already had a couple of those examples, right? Because first, what does the narrative do for us? Why are they important? They're how we make sense of the world. We basically live our lives as though we were in our own story. We understand how people communicate with us because we understand their position in that story. If I walk up to Brad tomorrow morning on the street corner and I say, John has a long mustache, he's going to look at me like I was nuts, unless there's a story that he can tell that this is a clandestine drop and I'm giving him the code. So that's how narrative functions, and it certainly functions at a higher level because so one dilemma at that higher level is going to be about deception, right? So you have the broader narratives that are in conflict. That shape how the different communities and organizations or whoever are in conflict are viewing it. And are we allowed to use deception in order to inform that narrative? Do we get to exploit or pressure perhaps influencers within that community in order to do things that conform to our narrative when they don't really want to do that? How much coercion would we be allowed to employ? I think that could be one set of ethical dilemmas that could arise. Then there's that internal one, I think, that I know Brad was talking about, where, and this goes back to your other question, when I took as the flip side of the first one, which is, when is it okay to do unsavory things to build trust? And that's, again, another place where and the narrative is going to matter, because you have to explain not only to your boss, you have to think about it. You have to explain to a much broader audience why you did what you did, and in fixing that. And so there's certainly going to be a lot of problems with dilemmas that arise from that. Now, some of them can be fixed in advance by getting authorities and permissions for certain kinds of actions and certain kinds of things that you might think you have to do, but let's ask the hard questions, and that you're on the ground and it comes up in the moment that the actor you're building trust with or you're building a relationship with or trying to use ask for something that we didn't anticipate. What do you do? That's that's another very tough one. And how you answer it's going to be depend on a lot the kind of story you're going to take back, and the kinds of considerations that you gave in making that. And so those, I think, are broadly the two kinds of things you might think about if you're trying to think broadly about how a narrative can inform and actually cause a lot of the dilemmas that we come up with.
Thanks, Tony. I really appreciate it. Jeff, do you want to add something to that conversation and possibly include some of the ideas about the difference between law enforcement and irregular warfare, specifically when you're balancing the need to sometimes be transparent, but also include the need to provide deception or to use deception?
It's funny, I wrote my master's thesis on Joseph and Stuart Alsop, the old columnists back in the day. Stuart was one of the original Jeds back in World War II. And one of their big articles that they had out, I think it was in the Washington Post, or Saturday Evening Post back then, was about the miasma of fear that was overtaking Washington back after the National Defense Act was signed right afterwards, because they viewed this overclassification and lack of transparency as fundamentally incompatible with our democratic institutions and values. And of course, we see as we move forward during the Cold War, how overclassification created some seriously embarrassing issues and also made some problems out of things that probably could have been dealt with if people were being straightforward about why things happened the way they did. Brad's point's right on the money here, where we're basically, we have the ability sometimes to add this material to help the narrative, to help the people who are downrange to be able, when you made this decision versus hanging them out to dry. The reality is, and the way politics works, is that, hey, listen, nobody wants to basically take that big old stinking diaper bag and hold on to it, because the narratives come out, it's already out on Twitter, it's streaming around the world. Now you have to go in and give a little more complex narrative, which of course doesn't fit in the 30-second slot on the news. So how do you combat that, and how do you do that and do right by these folks that are there? And oftentimes the reality is they have other folks in the policy realm that are breathing down their neck, telling them you need to do something about this because it looks bad, and we need to fix this problem, right? Make it go away, do something along those lines. And that, in a sense, has an unintended effect of reinforcing a subculture which already views itself as distinct, and where that trust issue is so important that, all of a sudden it's like, well, we can't trust them. We did what they asked. And so now they're asking us to, look out and police these issues that are on the front lines, that we need to be really above and beyond this and beyond reproach in this gray world that we're working in. That's kind of a difficult thing to ask. And police departments had to deal with the same thing. You always had the thin blue line, right? The people that, this wall of silence that would happen as police officers protect other police officers. And there was a reason for that. But at the same point, it also led to some absolute monstrosities of police officers, or even entire precincts or specialized units just going completely nuts. I mean, you think about the movie Training Day or the TV show The Shield. It's not an exaggeration to say that that's actually some of the things that we saw happening with Michael Dowd in New York and in other cases in LA and other cities. So that there is this interesting balance here. But when we're talking about distinct and peculiar ethics, when these issues come up, once again, we don't talk about when it's done right. We don't celebrate that. It doesn't sell. We don't do the best case studies and say, hey, listen, this is what, the Philippine insurrection, this Marine Corps officer made this decision not to go into the village and do these things. But what they did is they went down and took the risk of going in, weapons pointed down, having the talk, knowing that there might be a risk, but could actually build a strong relationship. We don't talk about that. That's not exciting. We're not going to celebrate people making these positive decisions. What we are going to do is we're going to have these other narratives that are going to pop up, because there's different stakeholders who have different narratives. And if the narrative is going to be politicized in DC, if it's going to advance careers in different ways across agencies and different areas, if it's going to impact coalition partners, is it going to impact our hosting relationship? What narrative are we going to grab, and are we going to hold on to? SOF is in that distinct and peculiar area because, once again, it's filling those gaps and it's working in that gray space. And it's really dependent on what narrative of the day we're going to be embracing. And is that chain of command going to step up and say, yeah, you know what? We screwed the pooch on this one. There were some issues here, but you have to understand this is the context of what we were looking at. In other cases, hey, our folks did the right thing. We were tasked with doing the following. There was an immediate and direct danger to the individuals involved, as well as to the larger mission and to our national interest. And we have to allow some leeway for our professionals to make the decision to get out of this. You have to pick that narrative at that point. And in one case, once again, your policy is not going to be perfect. It's going to be a series of trade-offs. And are the trade-offs going to be the individuals that might have been impacted by what SOF did? Is it going to be the trade-off for the people that were actually downrange doing things, the support elements, the policy side, the chain of command? Where does the trade-off and where does that stinking diaper bag land? And that's just going to happen every time. And it's because it's the nature of the beast. It's not going to go away. When we talk about our interest, our national interest, we don't talk about it from in the American perspective that the national interest is the same across the board like it is for any other country. Protect your territory, protect your population. We attach values to this. Where the Truman Doctrine did this very clearly during the Cold War. We were going to take our values because values were the key. The communists do this. We need to basically show how our values are better for providing for security and doing these things. The reality is that when we're pursuing that interest downrange, our values oftentimes just don't match up with these warfighting scenarios that SOF has to be engaged in with our host nation partners or with the insurgent group or the UW environment, whatever it is that we're dealing with. And that's this gap where, once again, the narratives begin to fill in. Police departments have had to deal with this for a long time, and it takes strong leadership to deal with it. If we remember what happened with regard to New York City with Rudy Giuliani as mayor and Commissioner Bratton coming in to run the department, they started running. There was a major corruption investigation in one of the precincts. I mean, a couple dozen officers were found. I mean, they were rolling drug dealers, assaulting people. I think there was some murders involved. I mean, all sorts of craziness going on. When Bratton and Giuliani, when they came out for the press conference, every officer has a badge with a number on it, and that gets passed down generation to generation as people retire. They came out and said, this badge will not be worn by another NYPD police officer again, because it has been tainted to the honor, the integrity of those that wear the shield. Flip that to another narrative where the police were involved with a particular shooting, and it was, by all intents, a very legit shooting that happened in that case. There was clear and present danger. They backed the officer because they knew what happened. They had the security cam footage. They had witness statements. Everything was there within a matter of hours. And they said, we feel confident in standing by this officer's decision, and they stood up for it. And they didn't just cater to the lynch mob who wants to basically take and throw somebody under the bus while they were trying to protect and serve. That type of leadership, which is able to point out the things that, and we all, that. I mean, you're in the locker room, who on the team is the one that's going to create the problem for you. Let's be very simple about that. We always know that. They might have great qualities, but we also know if we're going to turn away for 10 seconds, they're probably going to do something that's going to make things pretty miserable for us. But we also know those that are the solid folks that are going to do the right thing, always try to make those around them better. We need to celebrate. We need to recognize that. We need to hold these things accountable for when things are done right and when things are done wrong. And if it means being more transparent to do it, then that's a good day. But we owe it to those downrange to do this, and we owe it to those people that come into encounters with our special operations for that as well.
Thanks, Jeff. I think everyone's done a great job of laying out some of the details of the murkiness and some of the complexities involved in these operations. Brad, I wanted to see if you could talk to us a little bit about some of the negative aspects that come out of operating in this environment, specifically, and to go to one of the audience questions about moral injury. What are your thoughts on moral injury and how you would explain it to a tactical unit? And then also think about, as a person operating in that environment, how they are likely to respond to that conversation.
Yeah, Joe, I mean, I think, when I think about moral injury, I kind of, think of it as disorientation, right? So as again, back to that difference of degree, I think the environments in which we operate and the things we do are certainly very athletic as far as the frame shifting required. Again, from being a loving father or a friend, and then shifting frames to being something that people need to be afraid of in the night. And if you get lost as you're shifting those frames, then you can misapply certain rules that you play. So again, I think it's once again about bringing that all to the forefront and having conversations with the folks that you're entrusted to lead. The guys and gals that are coming up in the ranks. From day one. Being honest and open and creating that space where people can have those conversations. I'll pause there. Sorry.
Tony, I wanted to see if you had any responses to his thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, so moral injury occurs in a number of conditions, right, or context. When one does something one believes is wrong, and usually there's a severity here. When one is wronged, or one has observed a wrong. These can create different kinds of, what they do is they give rise to emotions such as guilt and regret that the person doesn't really feel like he or she has an ability to control. And that ends up driving behaviors that then are destructive, but also from the perspective of the person suffering, is something that they also can't control. So first, I think it is important that, and I think, Brad, you were basically getting at this, is that it's important for a community, particularly one in like special operations, where the opportunities for these injuries, as we've been discussing, are fairly widespread. If I understood our previous discussion correctly, is acknowledge that it's real. And then, ensure that there are resources, and ensure that there are permissions to raise this without compromising one's status as a professional, and then provide resources for treatment or addressing it. And a lot of it does go away with, and that kind of openness does alleviate a lot of the symptoms, so to speak. And then when that fails, is have a way of have the processes in place to allow that person to deal with those injuries. And I don't know much more, and so I think that's the first big step that I know even outside of special operations forces, we're still dealing with, and aligning that kind of professional help we want to give with the kind of suffering people are actually experiencing. But there's a lot more to be done on that, and special forces is probably in a great position to sort of lead the way in terms of, how do we deal this, even more broadly.
And Joe, if I could just add something to that point, I think I'm constantly struck, by how difficult we make it for people to do the right thing. And this goes back to the, how much time I spend navigating the internal terrain of the organization versus, sensing the environment and make sure I'm responding appropriately there. Everything from local policies as the kind of corporate DoD and SOCOM environment has grown. If I fly through two different theaters, there's a good chance that I'm going to have to do different things on my travel claim for those respective bill payers. I consume policy and spend a lot of time reading directives and everything like that, and I will never be done, right? Because we make it so difficult to do the right thing. So I think that's a kind of a reflective question for the organization of, how much cognitive space are we taking up on mundane policy and everything else that reduces the capacity of individuals to focus on what really matters, and whether it's leaders having those conversations with their folks, or just reflecting on their experiences and paying attention to the environment that they're in. The internal policy terrain is just so cumbersome and obnoxious that I think in many cases it detracts significantly from our ability to pay attention to what matters.
So I'm struck by that idea of kind of looking at agency and how much agency we have in dealing with the internal struggles that we face. But I wanted to add more of a regular warfare aspect to it and include one of the comments or questions rather from the audience. And that is looking at the agency of the partner forces that we're working with and through. So to what degree do a country's ethical norms, and even that, taking that, I want to add to that and add a little bit more to that, the partner forces that you're dealing with, ethical norms, outside the scope of what we would think of as DoD parameters. So how might those get justified for the greater good? And essentially what I'm getting at is to what degree does the partner forces agency impact the way that you're likely to behave? And I think all three of you would have an interesting response to this. So we'll go with Brad, then Tony, then Jeff.
Actually, can I add something? Because I want to bridge what was just said by Brad and Tony to what you just mentioned right here. I'm really amazed at the assumption that when we just talked about this whole issue of moral injury, we only treat it as if the moral injury will happen with people downrange, and nobody in the entire process up to the policy making who are making the decisions, the host nation, the partners that they go to that have their responsibilities in this. The onus is on the operator. The onus is on the folks that are doing this. We're not looking at this from the standpoint of the situations and decisions that are made and the moral responsibility. I mean, let's be frank. Moral responsibility can be abated if you get a nice book contract or a slot on a cable news network as a contributor or on a board later on, because you've made decisions that might not necessarily be the best ones, but hey, you came out of it without holding the diaper, right? And we left it with folks downrange. And I think it's important to think of that, but particularly as we're thinking about as these dynamics working in whole of government, the different agencies we work with domestically and the different folks that we work with that may be contributing to this problem, but also as we deal with the differences in culture and norms and values, as you just mentioned. And all of a sudden those actions become, I haven't really read too much on this issue. I don't really see much on the news about this whole issue about, hey, what about our poor Green Beret who was down there with these folks that he'd been working with, and all of a sudden they decide to go and do all this stuff. Look at what it did to this guy and how he's crushed by this, because it does crush his values and it does create these sort of issues. But has anybody interviewed the people that were doing it for what it did to their moral, compass and how they were doing these things? We don't do that. The onus is completely here, and it needs to be broadened, and we need to point that out. When you read your different manuals and you read, the COIN manuals and you read all the FID manuals and everything else, this aspect is just missing here. And it's because nobody wants to touch it. Nobody wants to be brought before Congress and say, why did you come out and say that these are going to be sticky wickets that you're going to be stuck with? And sometimes it's just, there's going to be just a degree of bad decision making is going to happen, because they're going to come back and say, well, your policy and your laws that you pass that prevent us from working with this human rights violator or keep us in this lane, or don't let us engage in corrupt practices where China's doing it or some other country's doing it or somebody else is doing it because it's not violating their law. But we can't do the same thing. So therefore we have to find ways around it, because our friends are saying, hey, listen, once again, government's an entrepreneurial profession. This is how we make our money. Mm-hmm. And those are tough things. And like I said, that stuff just isn't part of that conversation. And I think it really needs to be.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think you were working towards the question I was posing anyways about agency. Brad, what are your thoughts on the partner force's ability to inflict agency and shape the behavior that you're going to have?
No, I mean, I think that there's and this kind of goes into the, Dr. Wilson, I've had some conversations on this, the whole diversity and inclusion effort underway. I mean, I think caricatures aside, I think a lot of SOF are very cosmopolitan, right? And it's that certainly comes with a certain danger with the, I think the research is very clear about, it's interesting. The international travel actually increases your moral flexibility as you come to know other cultures and everything else. But I mean, I think all of us at this point have operated with partner nations downrange and supported populations where you feel a very personal investment with those folks. And to Jeff's point, when we saw ISIS take over, large swaths of Iraq, as I saw that unfolding on the news, the first thoughts I had were to, very personal relationships I had with people that we were supporting in Al-Anbar province, right? And not alone in that, because, certainly many text messages exchanged with folks within the community, and finding out the status of certain people and making sure that they were taken care of, and up to and including, just last year, one of the officers I served during an Iraq deployment, reached out on his own accord without even me prompting to let me know that an individual we worked with in Iraq was okay, and he'd had contact with him. So, I think that I think that there's very much a sense of appreciating the personal responsibility that people are taking to confront the challenges they face in their own environment. And I think most folks defer to that. I'll go ahead and pause there.
Thanks, Brad. So if we're looking at the degree to which a country where we're working, a partner force's ethical norms vary from our own, I'll pose this to you, Tony. What are your thoughts on our ability to build meaningful personal relationships given that environment?
Okay, so if I understand the question, it's like working with communities, organizations, or groups that perhaps have misogynist practices, human rights violating practices that they see as essential to their own identity and culture and very difficult for them to give up. Yeah, I mean, at some point. So, and you brought it up in the context of agency. I mean, so, when you're talking, for moral purposes, agency is about aligning intent and action. And so with that in mind, those are, what is it you're actually being asked to do, and what is your intent behind doing that? There's certainly not an ability to police or be held accountable for the practices of others. Nor a responsibility for policing them up and making sure that they conform to your own. However, it probably does limit the depth and quality of the relationship you might have, and it probably should do that. If I understand the the question correctly, when I taught at West Point, these things at West Point, we had the example of the lieutenant and his platoon go into the village, and the village is about to have a human sacrifice, and they want that lieutenant to participate. What does the lieutenant do? Kind of the short answer is, all things being equal, I would argue, don't participate. Even if that limits the depth of the quality of the relationship you might have. It's important for you to draw a line. You don't have to necessarily impose your views on others, but you do have to be very clear that you're not going to participate, even if that limits the kinds of things you might be able to do together. But why? Again, because we were talking about narratives and and the larger audience. Ultimately, we have to go back and say, we're not selling out. This goes back to a comment made earlier about the conditions on the ground and our values don't always align. That's true. However, that's the ethical challenge, is using a little bit of imagination, taking a little bit of risk, and being willing to own the consequences of one action in order to accomplish what you're out there to do, without betraying those values. Yeah, so to answer the question, I would certainly say there is, if they're really divergent, then you're probably going to limit the kinds of things that you can and should do with that particular community.
Joe, I think too often it's really easy to point to very egregious examples of I think some of the ones that are in public sphere of individuals that are molesting children, beating a wife, or something of that nature. But there's another more subtle human aspect of this that's actually crucial to engaging with populations. And, I think a great example is, during one of my times to a deployed environment, this thing that we're really good at, right? Of, this person is Al Qaeda #1 or IS #1, right? And you can just picture this guy that's just waking up and no clue that he's that individual, right? Because we've captured everybody else, so somebody is up. But you end up with a situation where, for instance, hey, this individual is forging identity documents for this terrorist network. So he's a facilitator. He's all this, and having the ability to look at it in context and realize, like, oh, this is just a dude who forges identity documents. I'm pretty sure he'd forge them for me if I paid him. And how you can actually, how crucial that is in many cases to actually understanding the environment and the context that you're operating in and making inroads into actually affecting change. So on the one hand, it's easy, again, whether it's our own moral failings or others, to go to these egregious examples. And in the process, we miss the subtlety and context of where a certain flexibility and awareness is actually important to accomplishing the mission.
Then I'm just going to jump in real quick just to underscore that, because the point I forgot to make is the example we gave the West Point cadets was a silly example. Mm-hmm. This isn't the problems there, the concerns that we, people on the ground in any military context typically confront. But and I think that's an important feature here, is to get, make sure we get the examples. If we want to get the norms right or the policy right, then we need to get the examples right. And telling these kind of far-fetched things aren't going to be useful.
Yeah. And I'd add that those areas that we talk about where there's these, well, we might have to pull away a bit because we're uncomfortable about this. But once this gets to Tony's point earlier about the proxy issue, what we often do is we can hire the contractor, or we can go to an allied nation, or we can have some other situation, arrest the drug trafficker, piloting stuff like Barry Seal, and then you give them a letter of marque and say, okay, go work for us now. Hands washed, and we just toss it to another organization that has more authority, maybe perhaps in that area. But we're fungible, and we got to be honest about that. We got to look at this and realize that when we run into these sort of things, we just find other ways and oftentimes other channels from which to do this. And that could, by, as I say, whether it's a deliberate intent or an undeliberate attempt, that it can basically still create some blowback for this particular community if that connection ends up being exposed or if it becomes transparent.
One of the things I think you bring up very well, Jeff, in that is that oftentimes when we're looking at, even just theoretically, the concepts behind population-centric insurgency type warfare, we tend to look at it through a dyadic perspective, right? Where there's a government and there's an insurgency, and those are the two main actors, and there's all sorts of political struggle, contentious political struggle that we're going to be participating in through some means, whether we're going to pick one side against the other. But you're kind of reminding us that the environment that we're actually inserting ourselves in is typically not dyadic. And so through the lens of possibly the old idea that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, what are your thoughts on how that affects our behavior, specifically when we're talking about our ethical behavior?
Were you talking to me directly, or you're asking the panel?
Yeah,
or okay. I mean, it is what it is. I mean, we had an order come down with the last administration saying that we can't take members of this community and dip them somewhere else to do the things that it's uncomfortable to do with our authorities. Same folks, same mission, different authority. Dip, remove, dip, remove. And in doing that, you're going to have these contacts with folks overseas that, it's going to be a different thing. You might have an exemption because of a particular authority now to work with that human rights violator, as long as the forms are filled out properly and the responsibilities taken care of. And that might be a good thing. It's not good or bad. I'm not arguing good or bad here. I'm just arguing it is. But we are going to do what we do to achieve that mission success. And we're going to find a way around it. And if it involves bringing in others to the mix, it's going to be done. And, and being honest about this, nobody's going to want to write and say this. Nobody's going to want to put this in a manual. Nobody's going to want to have the PowerPoint that's going to be under a Freedom of Information Act saying that, this is how this stuff has worked. These are the case studies. This is how it failed. This is how it succeeded. This is how we mitigated. This is how we got our partners to kind of police themselves and how this goes. That sort of stuff just does, it doesn't fly, because nobody wants to have that moment where you're brought before the committee and you're going to be asked about this, or you're going to have, Fox or CNN or somebody else on your front porch asking why this happened. And so, and once again, we're stuck with this reality. Then it's like, oh, look, here's the wheel. We just invented the wheel. Look at this. This is this new thing where there is this history of this. There are these practices, best and worst, that we can be leaning on, but it entails serious study. It entails serious delving into to say, listen, what works, what doesn't, and why? What are the individual level, the organizational level, the national level type issues, the policy making things that go into this, and having that sort of systematic study of this that can do this sort of thing might give us some foundation versus the murkiness that we're currently in, where we're trying to figure out. We're sitting on on a bunch of sand, trying to make these determinations, and everything's moving underneath us because we just don't understand what's the consistency in the human behavior, the organizational behavior, and moving on up the chain all the way up to the policy making side of it. So,
thanks, Jeff. I appreciate it. And I want to add to that and pose a question to Brad, thinking about some of those dilemmas that you talked about. So, Brad, from your perspective, as a person that was the coalface person, and that guy in the foxhole, so to speak, what are your thoughts on the way that we're preparing ourselves to deal with or to create coping mechanisms in these environments where we have to mitigate all sorts of complexities in order to try to do some version of a right thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think as I said earlier, just make it easy to do as easy as possible to do the right thing. And I think the other thing is a good rule to live by is just, if you feel like you need to be dishonest about something, you're probably not doing the right thing, right? And what I mean by that is, whether it's the darkest night downrange, and I'm doing SEAL stuff, or in any other facet of life, can you logically explain, what you're doing in a way that you think would make sense to your mother or your child or whoever. And you're generally going to be all right if you do that. So to Jeff's point, too often I think what we see is people parlaying at senior levels their political risk down to lower levels as actual real physical and moral risk to individuals. And hold those leaders accountable. And have control of your story and be able to explain what you're doing, why you're doing it. I can recall, very negative institutional reactions in some cases to, for instance, an Amnesty International report that came out in a downrange environment about a partner force. And the initial reaction of the organization was, kind of in opposition to the report, when if you just kind of dispassionately read the report, you could interpret it as like, hey, this is something we can have a conversation with them about, of, hey, maybe they're seeing something we're not seeing. Maybe these are things we can address, and not take that oppositional stance. And again, it just goes back to, transparency and honesty. Generally just try not to do things that you don't do dumb stuff, right? If you're able to account for your actions in an environment in a way that's going to make sense to a reasonable person, you're not going to go wrong. Politics are going to be politics, and people that want to play those games, they can play those games, and you don't need to be part of it.
Real quick, before we move on to something else, do you think that we do a good enough job, specifically, say, from a senior leader perspective, of responding to that rational person standard for whether or not people are making the right decisions or whether they're using effective coping mechanisms?
I think the media environment is just as challenging for us as it is for everybody else, whether it's my teenage daughter or a celebrity. It's a very challenging media environment for everybody. I think we can certainly get better in the house that we control with our senior leadership.
And to add to that, and this is for all of us here, one of the audience members brought up a very interesting question that makes all of the things we've discussed increasingly more complex and murky. And it's about the proliferation of deepfake software and how it impacts the narrative and how it increases the murkiness of us trying to make sense of what's actually happening in our world. What are your thoughts on the impact of that as we think about the SOF of the future?
Is that for anybody to jump in?
Yeah, please, Tony, go ahead.
Well, I'm going to answer it quickly, but in perhaps a less direct manner, because I want to pick up on something that Jeff was talking about. And it's important when you are to getting the ethics right, you do have to get how the profession functions right and what works. But the fact that something works, even in that professional context, doesn't make it ethical. So we have to give some thought to that. Now, when it comes to the deep fakes, what's that about? Well, that's about, I guess the question is really about, should we be allowed to use deep fakes? Because it's very easy to say to others that, don't use deep fakes against us and try to make it, illegal, immoral, or whatever. And call it cheating when they do that. But the question is, should we be allowed to do that? And that's a question about deception. And to answer that question, you have to, you have to go back to some of the basic principles I was talking about earlier. One thing, particularly when you're targeting someone for exploitation, that targeting has to be discriminate. There has to be something about that person that warrants that kind of targeting. So it's one thing to employ a deep fake targeting a adversary's or an enemy's intelligence operation, right? Or that because they are in the game, so to speak, and they should be aware that they are subject to these kinds of things. And so when that targeting is discriminate, yeah, that's probably something that that would be permitted. When you're doing it more broadly, I think you're gonna. I think that's understudied and undercovered area, because while it's certainly useful, it might even be considered a best practice for our adversaries. It also raises a lot of concerns. So just because it works, again, I would say we really should be circumspect about employing it, because once it comes out, we do that. We diminish the kinds of things Brad and Jeff have also been talking about, such as transparency, building trust, and those kinds of things that matter. And finally, I'll just say one thing about the use of deep fakes, I think, is that ultimately they, if they're not used very discriminately for very particular things, if they're used very broadly, then they're self-defeating. Eventually, somebody figures out that you're doing it, and then they don't trust anything that you say. And if you can tolerate that, great. I don't know that our way of doing business tolerates that kind of deception on a broad scale.
Thanks, Tony. I really appreciate that. And I want to add to this while I was thinking about it and pose a question back to you, Jeff, and then we'll see what Brad thinks. What types of things can we do in this environment we're talking about with the deep fakes to mitigate the effect against us? So essentially, how can we inoculate ourselves from our adversaries' use of deep fakes to make our behavior look worse than it is, right? To keep ourselves from running into dilemmas where the enemy makes it look like what we've done is not what it really is.
It's funny. In the last couple of weeks, I was asked, my son's high school teacher had to have an emergency open heart surgery. And so they asked me, and I've stepped in to be a substitute high school teacher for the last couple of weeks. So it's interesting with the young ones, because we were talking about these issues, about what they chase and the whole bit. And I guess to answer that question, it's just a whole different world for me to hear them and how they're thinking, because they're so this all the time. But when we were talking about this related issue, it became an issue of, listen, we're just cynical about everything. We just, we don't treat anything as truth anymore, and because they're just realizing that everything is, you're being fed one thing, it might be true, but it's for a purpose, and they're getting it. and they're understanding that, and they're much more skeptical. There's a natural process that's going on. And so the skepticism that goes in, I think once again, you start thinking about this societally, educationally, whatever else, is just, all you can really do is build that healthy, case of skepticism, and hopefully these kids just start learning that on their own. They're learning it at their families or learning it at their schools. But, that's all I'm, as far as I can see, as somebody who's not an expert in this, I'm not an expert in the MISO PSYOP and all that other fun stuff. But to me, it's a natural occurrence. As Tony said, as these things fail, whoever's dishing it is going to have less credibility. It's going to start falling apart. And I think the same thing goes also besides just that, but also this deplatforming craze that goes on, where you're basically just, I don't like this, so therefore I'm going to call you and label you blank, and therefore take you off the internet and take you off this mechanism, or cancel you out of, being on the news or having your perspective talked about. That's just not smart. I mean, to me, that leads to more radicalization and more, more us versus them mentalities versus being honest and just having an honest discussion and saying, hey, listen, you believe that, I get that, but you know what, have you ever think about the source material? Let's think about this. Here's some other stuff, and let's look at my source material. That's just not a mindset, that some people do, but they might have the skepticism, but they don't necessarily go to that next step. And maybe that's where the answer lies. I don't know.
Thanks, Jeff. I appreciate it. Since we're out of time, I wanted to give you the last word, Brad, as the person from the foxhole.
Yeah, I think it just tell a better story. That's all you can do. Tell an honest and better story. And we have those stories to tell.
Fantastic. Well, like I said, that's all we have time for at this point. I'd like to thank all three of you for coming out, and it's been a fantastic experience, and it's been a lot of fun working with all three of you and shaping a lot of important narratives about how we even frame the idea of ethical decision-making and ethical behavior in our own minds. So before we start the second panel on special operations ethics, let's go ahead and take another short break, and we'll be back shortly.